guys. This is actually going to be an appreciation week. So today, Tuesday and Thursday, are both going to be about appreciation. So what we're going to appreciate this week is musical theater, American musical theater, one of the uniquely American art forms. The other art forms for music today that I wanted to mention is jazz, the blues, soul music, hip hop. Those are also uniquely American forms. They've gotten their influence from elsewhere, but the popularity is uniquely American. Other forms of popular music in America have sort of been shared with Britain, rock and roll, pop, other kinds of, even though rock and roll does have a lot of its where it came from the blues and jazz. The famous rock and roll bands, many of them are British. So, but going back to musical theater, what I want to tell you is this. Musical theater gets its start from a place in the 1800s. Now, theater has existed since the ancient Greeks and before. And there's always been music and comedy and variety acts and things like that on stage forever. But what happened in America in 1881 was something kind of special. Up to that point, most of that kind of entertainment was geared towards male audiences. They served things that you shouldn't drink in public as beverages, and they had subject matter that wasn't necessarily family friendly. So what happened was a guy named Tony Pastor said, hey, this should be family stuff. There should be something that people can go to with their wives and their kids and enjoy as a family. So he created something called vaudeville, and that was in October of 1881 at the 13th Street Theater in New York. And what that was a way to take musical acts, variety acts, acrobatics, jugglers, magicians, comedians, opera singers, people who played the banjo, people who played the trombone, family acts, put them all together on stage and have a show. Now, nothing really linked them together, though. They were just variety acts. You'd have somebody come in with a little board. It would say, the Gum Sisters. That's Judy Garland's act when she was a little girl. And so that is how it started. And then it grew. And suddenly it became all about where you traveled to. So it wasn't just that you always did your show at that one theater in New York. No, because there were no movie theaters, there was no TV sets. In order for people around the country to be able to see your show, you had to go to them. So they would set up near train routes, and you'd put all of your sets and everything on a train, and you would go to these different cities. So there was a city in Illinois called Peoria. And to this day, people will say, well, I don't know, does it play in Peoria? And what they're referring to is the content of the act so common and so palatable to everyone that the people in Peoria, those people that work the farm every day, are they going to appreciate it? Is it going to be some word called blue for them? And blue means those bad words and bad subject matters. They would actually get a blue letter if their act was crossing the line. There were signs backstage that said all the things that you weren't allowed to say. One of the things you weren't allowed to say, this is how things change, slob. Somehow the word slob was a really, really bad word in the 1890s. And so there were words that you weren't allowed to say. Son of a gun, couldn't say that. And if you did, you got a blue envelope. So those blue content now is what's referred to as stuff that you really isn't family friendly that you shouldn't say. So these acts would go around. If you could play Peoria, you were good. And if you could play Peoria, there were 3 different kinds of theaters that you could play. You could do small time, medium time, or big time. So the phrase, you made it big time, referred to vaudeville. And what that meant was, if you played small time, that meant that you were doing your show maybe in a tent that was set up temporarily for the show, or in a park, something like that. If you were medium time, you made a little bit more money, and you were put up in slightly nicer hotels, and you got to play at a theater that was established as a theater with permanent seats and that kind of thing. If you made it big time, then that meant that you were playing big theaters, staying at lovely hotels, and you had large houses, tons of seats, tons of people, and you were making big time money. People back then, 1800s, making $1,000 a week. $1,000 a week? That's a lot now. But you can imagine for these people who, their families are probably lucky to get by on 15 cents a week, and they were making thousands a week. It was enormous. So when you made it big time in vaudeville, you really made it big time. So then what happened was, quite a lot later, in the 1900s, there was a famous impresario. Now, impresario is a word that refers to somebody who puts on a really big show and really knows how to sell it. So not only does he produce well, as in putting together the show, he also knows how to get people in the door. And one of the biggest was P.T. Barnum. There's a little movie from a few years back called The Greatest Showman that's about that gentleman. But he did circus. So he did animal acts, really massive acrobatics using trapezes and high wires and that sort of thing. Things that didn't make any sense for a smaller theater venue, smaller theater space. So this particular gentleman named Florin Ziegfeld felt that the shows should be more elevated. Not only should they be family friendly, but they should also be sumptuous and gorgeous and over the top and bigger than anybody could imagine. So he created these giant sets of these staircases that went up forever on the stage. And he had what were called the Ziegfeld girls. And they were gorgeous women. And he dressed them in these designer, beautiful gowns with dripping crystals and rhinestones and jewels and giant feathers and these headdresses that weighed 50 pounds each. And these girls had to learn how to walk beautifully and gracefully while carrying these giant things on their heads. So if you were a Florin Ziegfeld showgirl, you were also one of those girls making $1,000 a week or more. Fanny Brice was one of the wealthiest women of her generation. She was one of Florin Ziegfeld's leading ladies. He would create shows around her, and what she was kind of a homely woman, not beautiful at all. She didn't look anything like those showgirls, but could she sing? She was a singer and a comedian. So she would do spoofs like about Swan Lake. So there'd be all these beautiful girls doing ballet around her, and she'd be doing a very silly dance, which is a whole nother genre called grotesque, which is a kind of a French and German thing. And I'm not going to go any further into it now. But anyway, so she sort of capped on comedy. She had a Baby Snookums, Baby Snooks character. And these characters were known across the country. Even though the Ziegfeld Follies did not tour in the same way. They didn't do the same circuits like the Orpheum circuit that earlier vaudevilles had done. You wanted to go see a Ziegfeld show, you had to haul your cookies to New York to see it. He had two different shows. He had the one in his main theater, and he had something called On the Roof. On the top of the theater, on the roof, they would do a show after the show. So sometimes those were acts that were trying to get tried out and get into the show. Today, it's the same thing kind of happens in comedy clubs. You have the mainline acts, and then you have the people that come on later in the evening that are trying to make a career for themselves. So Florin Ziegfeld was sort of the first one to do that, impresario. So what happened in 1927 was he decided that musical theater should be a thing. He created it. It hadn't existed before. And what it was you take all those musical acts that you got, and instead of creating a show around an actor like Fanny Brice or Will Rogers, who was another one of his big performers. He was a cowboy comedian, and he gave advice, and he told jokes, and he twirled a rope the whole time. He was a huge hit. So instead of building a show around these personalities, he decided the show should have a story. And all of the dances and all the numbers and all the acts should be linked together with this story. Before that, things had only been linked together maybe with a skit here and there, and it was always comedy. It was never really serious. And so he said, why don't we do something that's got both comedy and drama in it? So he took a book by Edna Ferber called Showboat, and he decided to make a musical out of it with his Ziegfeld Follies. And the difference on that show is that the singers are not just singing a production number. They're singing their hearts. They're singing the story. So you've got Make Believe is a number between two characters where they're talking about what if life were like a show. If I loved you in the show, would I love you in real life? But they're not on stage when they're singing it. They're singing it on the deck of the showboat to each other. You've got a girl singing about the man she loves and how he doesn't treat her well. And so there's the drama part, right? She loves him anyway. Can't Help Loving That Man of Mine is the name of that song. And she talks about how he's terrible, but she loves him anyway. Poor thing. Then there's another song. It's a guy all by himself on the dock, and he's taking the big giant ropes off to let the boat go. Showboat being about a big giant paddle wheel or boat on the Mississippi that they would do shows on. So people would come on board and see the show and then leave. But the people in the show lived on the boat. So this gentleman is getting the boat prepared to go, and he's singing a song about Old Man River, and he's talking about how life, even though things happen to you and work is hard and life is hard, that life is like the river and the river just keeps flowing. So just those 3 songs alone are like musical theater gold, and they were all in that first show called Showboat. And those songs are written by Jerome Kern and Richard Rogers, Oscar Hammerstein. So those 2 gentlemen got together, as he did back then. Quite often, the songs for a show were written by 2 people. We've talked about that before in songwriting, that sometimes people are really good with writing for instruments, writing melody and writing for instruments, and some people are really great at writing words, writing the lyrics, like a poet. And sometimes it takes 2 guys to put it together. Other guys can do both at once, but most really great musicals are written by 2 guys, or 2 women, mostly 2 guys. So Showboat was this incredible groundbreaker, blew people away. They didn't see it coming. They didn't know what they were watching. They were freaked out. But still, there were big, giant production numbers that they wanted to do because Ziegfeld had these acts that he wanted to use. So you still had a funny dog act, and you still had, a comedic duo doing a dance, and you still had all of that because it was set on a showboat. So they could do the show numbers from the showboat in the show. So that was something that they used as a method to get musicals done for the next 20 years. Most of your best Irving Berlin and Cole Porter were 2 really great writers. They wrote by themselves. And they wrote a lot of songs that were used in movie musicals in the 1930s. Stuff that Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire were in. Broadway Melody of 1940, Swing Time, Top Hat. All those movies are set backstage. So it's musical theater people. And when you see Fred Astaire do a big giant dance number, it's usually in context of being in that show. Every once in a while, you would have a song that would come up in the real world, like in Easter Parade, he wants to buy a bunny for his girlfriend on Easter, and a little kid wants it, so there's a drum set, so he does a whole song and dance about how great drums are. So every once in a while there would be a number that sort of made sense in context, but those songs weren't driving the show. That drum number had nothing to do with the plot of Easter Parade. It was just a cute number. So that's the way things progressed until 1943. In 1943, Rodgers and Hammerstein, that same guy that wrote Showboat? Yeah, things had been progressing in everybody's minds. And when they decided to finally do this show, they decided to really, really depart from the show within a show idea. And all of the numbers in Oklahoma tell the story forward. They all contribute to the storyline. And that's called a book musical. When the whole musical, everything about it, nothing's disjointed, nothing's taken out of context. It creates a depth of emotion in the viewer that was, even in Showboat, which was very emotional, which was lacking. So this one, again, blew people away. They couldn't believe how deep it was. And this was the first time also that the opening number, instead of being a big production number, was just a guy riding out onto the stage on a horse, singing about the morning. Oh, what a beautiful morning. So that was the progression from vaudeville to the first musical theater to the first true book musical theater. Now, as we progress beyond that, as I mentioned earlier on, usually musicals were associated with the people that wrote the music, not the people that wrote the book. I mean, I can't even remember who wrote the book for Oklahoma, even though Oklahoma is well known for its book. I don't know who it was written by. I do know that it was based on a play, which was based on a novel, but I don't know who it's by. I know that it's Rodgers and Hammerstein did the music, and that's what's important about that one. So Rodgers and Hammerstein, if their names were on a show, people would go see that show. They wrote a whole lot of shows. They wrote Sound of Music and The King and I and State Fair and a lot of great shows. And you went to go see that show just simply because they wrote it. A little later on, people would go see a show because of who was in it. Then a little later on, they would go see a show because of who choreographed it, who came up with the dances. And in a lot of cases, that was also the same as the director. You almost never really heard about who the director of a musical was unless they were also a choreographer. Today, when you know about directors, it's for movies. When you know about writers, it's a lot of times for TV or for plays. When you know about the composers, it's still a lot of times about the musicals. So going back from that Oklahoma and coming forward a little bit, you had a lot of movie musicals, the MGM great musicals that were written, and a lot of those were choreographed by Jerome Robbins and Gene Kelly, who was one of my favorite choreographers for film. He learned that what worked on stage was not the same as what worked in a movie. So like with tap dancing, Eleanor Powell and Fred Astaire were amazing tap dancers, but they would record the sound of their taps in a studio, and then they would perform the tap dance live. Now, Fred Astaire was a perfectionist. They would rehearse until their feet bled, but he wanted to get it right. Gene Kelly, on the other hand, while he would still rehearse till your feet bled, he believed in getting it to look good. So when you were recording those taps in your session, you kept your footwork small so you could hear everything, but when you performed it, you did it big. So he had this really large style of dance that was very, very different from anybody before him, anybody's style of dance in any movie. It was gigantic, it was athletic, it was jazz, it was fantastic. And his choreographic style, he had to teach that to people who had been hoofers in all the previous movies. So when he did Singing in the Rain with his co-star, the co-star had to learn how to make everything big. And he's like, you don't have to worry about hitting that tap. We already recorded it. Just get your foot out there, right? So he had to teach him how to just play it big. Now, so that was a choreographer for which, if a movie is out and if I see a movie playing on cable and it's a Gene Kelly movie, I want to watch it because I know the dancing is going to be great. So then live theater, Broadway, musical theater, we have Bob Fosse and Jerome Robbins. Bob Fosse was a choreographer in the 1960s and 70s and a little bit into the 80s. His style was very, very sassy. Talk about those blue envelopes. Sometimes he went a little bit blue with his choreography, but the thing about live theater, musical theater, is while vaudeville strove to be really, really clean, Broadway after that decided that they really wanted to be marketable. So They don't have a rating system. There's no G, PG, PG-13R, any of that. When you go to see a show, it may be perfectly clean and it may have some blue stuff in it. You don't really know. But they still want to keep audiences coming in, so it's never going to get too crazy because they want to appeal to everyone. Just like the playing in Peoria, they still want that to be true. But the thing is, Peoria these days, they're a little more savvy than they were back then. So theater has evolved with it. So Bob Fosse's style was a little bit on the sassy side, a little bit on the kitschy, like cute, eclectic, campy. His stuff is funny and silly. And not as big as Gene Kelly's stuff. His stuff is smaller. It's all about the finger, a finger right here that moves, and the whole audience is looking just at that finger, right? So that's what I love about Bob Fosse. He also had a wife, and her name was Gwen Verdon, and he wrote stuff specifically for her. Now that was the other thing I wanted to mention, is that musical theater, in addition to being important for the composers and the choreographers, it was also important for women. Women were the headliners in musical theater, not the men so much. So you went to go see a show because Ethel Merman was in it, or Mary Martin was in it, or Gwen Verdon was in it. Ethel Merman was like the biggest star of all back in the day. And Mary Martin did everything from Peter Pan to South Pacific. So I'm going to give you some examples of these people as well, so you see who they were. These were people that when film came to redo their movies, sometimes they didn't do as well because these were live stage performers who had auras, presences that were huge that didn't play as well on film. So sometimes, when you're casting something like that, you got to be aware of the different levels of different kinds of talent. But that's what people went to go see, though, were these particular people. Now, when we get to the choreography, Jerome Robbins was cool because there was a show called West Side Story. What's great about West Side Story is it was written by a composer called Leonard Bernstein. And Leonard Bernstein was a contemporary classical composer. And his stuff is edgy and it's got a lot of minor chords and strange rhythms. Remember we talked about rhythm and time signature? His time signatures are so difficult that when his dance captain was trying to plot out the rumble scene in West Side Story. West Side Story is a show about rival gangs in New York in 1960 and how the fighting scenes are done through dance. So there's a remake coming of that with Steven Spielberg this year. And what's neat is that choreographer, Jerome Robbins, head of the New York City Ballet, the new choreographer for the new movie is also one of the artistic directors at the New York City Ballet. So it kind of comes full circle. But these rhythms were so complicated that the dance captain had to count them out for them in rehearsals, and the counts went to like 35 and then to 7 and then to 19, and it was very, very weird. So I'm going to actually give you a clip of the rumble scene so you can see that there's music, but it's weird, hard to count, and that the fighting that happens in there is all choreographed beat for beat. There's no accidents, it's not improv, it is beat for beat rehearsed. There was so much rehearsal on that show and so much difficult dance that the dancers all would pray for rain. They would do like rain dances and they had knee pads for one scene, and when they were finished filming that scene they burned their knee pads. So Jerome Robbins was quite a taskmaster, as a lot of these choreographers were. So musical theater then, so we've got all these very big choreographers that sort of dominated in the 1970s and 60s and 70s. And then something happened called a concept show or an idea show. And that was Stephen Sondheim, a really great composer, also writes kind of weird stuff. He sort of championed this idea of writing a show about an idea. So some of his shows, like Company, are really interesting and great. Into the Woods. What if all the fairy tales don't end where they end? What happened after that? That's what Into the Woods is about. So Sondheim was actually the lyricist for West Side Story. So these concept ideas, there was a musical that happened in the 1979, and that was called A Chorus Line. And the idea of it was just to give you an inside look at what it was like to be in the theater, to be in musical theater, to be a chorus member in musical theater. And it sort of decomposed the genre and built it back up again for you in the space of 2 hours. So I think I'll conclude my group of clips for you with a piece from that show. But suffice to say, beyond that, that's 1979, that's not exactly current, right? There's a lot of great shows right now, lots of them. And they've started to go back to that really great period. There was a section of musical theater around the 2000s, the 90s, that were all about big giant British musicals rather than American musicals. And they're more like operas, and they're big opulent shows, Les Miserables and Cats and Phantom of the Opera. And they're all about these giant sets, and they're not so much about the storytelling. So what's happened now is that we've gone a little bit back more to storytelling, like with Hamilton and Book of Mormon and Spamalot, and some fun shows that are more about the fun of musical theater and less about the production value. So some of those big producers of those shows were Andrew Lloyd Webber. There was, for a while there were producers that were famous, just like back in the days of Ziegfeld. Schoenberg was a big producer, did Les Miserables and Miss Saigon. He didn't write them, but he was the producer of them. So, see, things come full circle eventually, don't they? So I'm going to send you some clips, and we'll talk further about this another time.